We're in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am super excited to welcome our next guest on the interview series, Shijuade Kadree. She is the Director of Diversity Strategy at Snap Inc. and founder and principal of Compass Strategies Consulting. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Oh, wow. So Christina, thank you so much for the introduction and super excited to chat. So yes, my name is Shijuade Kadree. My pronouns are she and her. And what I want to be when I grow up, my goodness, I think the question and answer always ranged. One, my mom is a physician, and so I adore her in all the ways. And I was like, well, clearly I want to be like my mom, so I want to be a doctor. And then I've always been told I was super chatty and people used to try to pay me to stop talking, and that I had sort of the gift of gab. And then I had this idea, the idea of being a lawyer was introduced to me when I was young as well. And I was like, I can't pick one, like, what am I supposed to do? And I remember, again, I was kind of, was an interesting child, a little overzealous in thinking about all of this from a young age. But I remember watching Oprah one day, and there was, she was interviewing someone who was an MD JD. And I was like, you could be both. And maybe for context, it's helpful to know my mother is from Trinidad. My dad is Nigerian. So I only had so many choices, right? Doctor, lawyer, engineer. I had to exceed all expectations of what my job opportunities were. And so the idea that I could be both blew my mind. And so I went to college anticipating this really interesting long pathway of trying to pursue both degrees. And in my first year, exploring pre-med, there was no joy it brought for me, like even a little bit. So yes, science is really cool. I get statistics, but there was nothing that sparked a desire to push there. But I really loved sort of all of my liberal arts classes, just exploring and learning. I love to, very spongy, I guess. So I'm always looking for like the quick facts, the deeper dives, the interesting. And I think because I ended up being a lawyer, I'm always looking for the other side, right? You said it was left, but like, are we sure it's not right? And who said it was right? And why did we say it was right? And can we change that? So all that is to say, I really enjoyed the liberal arts side of my sort of exploration. And I was like, I'll go to law school. And as I went through college, did a few interesting fellowships that opened my eyes to like what I could do with the degree. I had no idea. And ironically, I remember thinking, I was watching some sort of like Law and Order and seeing a prosecutor sort of talk about child abuse and going back and forth. And I was like, I could never be a public defender because like, I don't know if I agree with the prosecutor, but I know I don't want to like represent someone who's like abused children. Who wants to do that? And then my first job after law school is a public defender. Focus, right? Yeah. Focus on child welfare, actually. And it's just like, it was just this idea of like, the more you know, the more you're exposed to, the more you're challenged, your mind is just opening to different opportunities. And so I say that because like, the more I learned, the more my like shift around what I wanted to pursue or what I thought would be interesting for my career. And the last thing I'll sort of say is I really have had the fortune of having parents who never did one thing. Yeah. I don't know if it's part of like the immigrant hustle or whatever it might be, but they very much were like, you have a responsibility and an opportunity to do more and to do good and to be a resource for others. That was their whole thing. So they're always like dipping and darting into lots of circles. And so I didn't feel the same pressure necessarily that I had to like pick a lane and stay in it. They were just like, pick a lane. And so it's just been, it's been a gift that I have now, although they weren't necessarily thrilled that I went into public defense.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, you have had an incredible amount of experiences advocating for people in the law, really organizing, and we've talked about this as well. Fast forward to today in diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging work. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point in your career?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, especially now that I've moved from I would say, traditional or expected social impact into tech. And so I definitely see this still as like civil rights work, and I'm just operating in a different courtroom. I would say that because I see it as civil rights work, I've always tried to think about equity and justice, right? Like those are core values that I was definitely had instilled in me as a kid. I'm one of four. My sisters and I were all like very clearly reared in one direction. Like no matter what you do, you must give back. And it just took me a while to figure out like, what can I give that's not, I mean, money and time are also important, but I was like, I want my whole life, like I want my day to day to feel connected and inspired. And that has kind of woven through everything that I've done. And I've just seen the law as a tool to help me weave that together. And then I also got my master's in public health because I realized that in the law, especially going to a private law school where everyone was like, I want to go to a big firm, I want to make money. And I'm like, I was like, what about the people? What about the people? So I got my MPH to think about how to be a good organizer, how to connect and translate complex concepts into everyday language, and then see that I could be a resource, not coming in to dictate what I should do with any community, but like, how can I be a resource in that way? So I've taken those two sort of, I don't know, more traditional trainings and tried to think, well, I was in the courtroom for a while. And in that space, I learned one, the law is only designed to benefit those who drafted it. So those were basically never my clients, right? That I could only be as good a lawyer as I had access to good law. So that kind of prompted me to go to city council and think about like drafting laws and passing bills on behalf of a community, one, that I was impacted by, but two, I think good policy or better policy is made by folks who are impacted by it and really know how it works on the ground, right? Like those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So I was trying to be some version of a bridge. And I quickly learned that the level of politic in trying to get a bill passed had little to do with constituency and everything to do with the people sort of moving bills, but it was good. Like I learned the thing, I showed up as myself, and then went to go do a lot of thinking about, again, the law. Constituents are supposed to hold electeds accountable. So like, let me work on a constituent sort of field and coalesce around a common identity and what are the things that we could be doing and recognizing we're multifaceted and multi-issued people, right? So I went to work in a queer space, loved so many things that I got to build there, but also trying to dismantle the monolith of the LGBTQ community, right? Each letter and then some mean a lot, right? We can talk about race, we can talk about gender identity, we can talk about class and immigration status and xenophobia and like the internalized homo and transphobia within the community. Like lifting all of that up was really impactful for me. It made me feel more situated and confident in my own identity and like grappling with all the messages I heard as a kid around my own queerness, but then feeling really good about that. I started my consulting practice because I didn't want to be silenced about what I could and couldn't say anymore. And that really gave me a chance to think about strategy and policy and this view I have of kind of an unapologetic Black queer feminist, right? Like, let's do the thing. And then somewhere in there, some things happened in 2020. People started calling for action that has been happening for decades, right? People like us who have been doing this work with or without a title for many, 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 many years, who carried water for us to be able to have a conversation like this right now and speak so freely. Certain folks started calling that like DEI, right? Like we need a DEI person. We need someone to help us reflect the humanity that we seem to be lacking in our space. And that's how I kind of ended up in this work, right? I've always done the work. It's the title that maybe is a little bit different. And I'll be honest, I really hesitated actually, because I am a Black woman and there are a lot of women of color overall, there are a lot of queer folks, there are a lot of historically marginalized folks leading these initiatives. And I feel like when the world fell apart, a lot of places said, Black women, can you fix this? And it just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good. And I hesitated about, while the work seemed interesting, having that title of being boxed into like, this is the thing you can do. And this is the thing you can do in tech, not being an engineer, or not working finance, or not working sales. Like, you can do this people function. And I had to have a lot of like come to Jesus conversations with myself, with my partner, with my chosen friends, to be like, this is the work I've always been doing.
Yes.
Now it has a fancier title in certain spaces, but do I want to take this on?
Yeah.
And, you know, it's something that I have to be in conversation with myself about all the time, in order to stay sort of grounded in this work, right? You can't get comfortable in it, or else you're doing a disservice to everybody that could be impacted by it.
You can get comfortable in it, and you have to be really intentional about the spaces that you are, showing up in as well.
Right.
I think, you started off by saying that this is civil rights work, and I definitely agree with you as well. And the question becomes, how can I be most effective? Where do I want to impact the most change? And especially
Right.
over the last few years, a lot of people are questioning kind of where they want to go and where they want to have that impact. From your perspective, what is the role of private organizations, employers, companies to really make a difference in creating more equity in the world, knowing that a lot of people, I would say most folks, need to work, and your employers or the place that you're working at is a microcosm of society, the community you're in, as well.
Can we have a margarita for this?
Yeah, I'm down.
I think that's such a deep question. I actually had started to open the door to this conversation with a team member not too long ago, where, because I've moved into the private sector, a lot of just people in my world have been like, what is that like? And like, do you want to do it? And like, tech is a thing, right? And there are a few things that have stood out to me as I've been reflecting on it a little bit more. One, I think in the nonprofit space, just generally speaking, and really in government, we're taught that, like, especially in a capitalist society, cash is king. The private sector knows what they're doing. They are able to make money and you don't make money. So like, obviously they've gotten it right? Like, our values around this are so skewed. So in the nonprofit space, you have the nonprofit industrial complex striving to be like a system that we were not theoretically intended to be, right? Our missions don't necessarily align. And then you have this value around private experience being far better than any lived experience that someone might have on the ground, the schools we go to, the kind of pedigree you bring to it. So there's an interesting swing that I continue to see of nonprofit leaders who are installed by boards that are often heavily corporate. And so they like see each other, they see their values. They're like, oh, she worked at American Express for 15 years. She clearly understands how to run a nonprofit. Like, of course she understands. And it's like, what? Why are you minimizing that space and the work that we do and the values that we might bring? And so you have those leaders coming in, all good intentions, but we know intentions are not necessarily connected to impact. Building out these teams and staffs, and then trying to almost recreate, like, well, I learned this in this private sector. So with less resources, a different culture, and less buy-in, I want to recreate that system here. And a lot of that tension and friction going back and forth. And so I give that as an example because I think in some spaces I've worked, they are trying to replicate this idea of corporate structures. And that doesn't work in the nonprofit space, and it shouldn't. It just shouldn't. I didn't enter that space because I wanted to fake be in a corporate space. I wanted to like do the work, connect to people, and feel like my body was involved in service of others. But all that is to say is that now, being in the sort of private sector overall and being in tech specifically, if it's supposed to be the paradigm for other movements, then let me try and make it paradigmatic. Like, what could we be doing if everyone's gonna, not everyone, but theoretically trying to replicate what they see here? Then we should really be pushing and doing more. And as I do that, I just come back to, I think in the nonprofit spaces, partially because they're smaller, even when they have several hundred people or even 1,000 folks, are so smaller than a lot of corporations, they move more nimbly. I find that folks are willing to say the thing. They may not always have the answer, but they're willing to also do the thing, because the expectation is, if I want this, then I got to figure out how to do it. And I also think that there's, at least in the spaces that I've had the privilege of working within, a willingness to like tussle and engage in the hard conversation. White saviorism runs rampant in the nonprofit sector, right? I'm not trying to say that, and that we're all beholden to those systems in different ways unless we challenge that bias. But I just felt like I could have those conversations and move in a different way. Didn't mean it wasn't easy, But I find that there's also this belief now in the sort of private sector writ large, not necessarily about Snap specifically, but that this is the real work, right? Like, and it is work, I'm not gonna lie about that, but like that this is like so much harder than working in a sort of a food kitchen and providing meals several times a day to people who are looking for food today. That is some crazy, intense, hard work. Being a public defender, dealing with people's lives and trying to work in a system that was never designed to affirm those lives, that is hard, grinding work. Having conversations and trying to bring funders along into a journey where they think they know better than you, even though they've never set foot in the community, that is hard work. And so I think about those dichotomies in my head a lot when I hear the urgency that people have sometimes in my work, where I'm like, as a colleague always says, we are changing lives, not saving lives. And it matters. The work matters. We need to take care of ourselves in it, but it's not lost on me some of the irony of how we hold corporations in such high esteem, but they're just made of people. The same people who have biases and all the isms and the phobias and happen to make more money with all of those biases sort of in their bag.
Absolutely. And I think the whole conversation around intention versus impact, a lot of people wanting to really do great things, but what does that look like in practice? Are you supporting, investing in these, having these hard conversations? Are you kind of bringing humility into the conversation as well, and consistently learning, unlearning, and making space for others? I know you mentioned kind of your hesitations around this role and leaning into this space as well in terms of making a difference. And there are diversity, equity, inclusion leaders and practitioners who were just hired. And there are people from program manager to chief diversity officer. A lot of people want folks in this role. It is a full-time job. What is your advice for these folks who feel like their organization is just commodifying diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and really just providing lip service for current or potential employees, but they are in this role and want to make a difference? I feel like that is also a hard dichotomy to really think about.
It's deep, right? It's deep. I think truly the first thing is find some community around this. Find your other, whether it is your personal circle of friends who understand you and what you're trying to do, and then looking for other folks with similar titles or roles who you can just commiserate with. Like, I found that incredibly impactful, because if we're really thinking about DEI as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and building this path and building this future that we don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but we know that it's not what it is right now is not it. What it was 50 years ago definitely wasn't it. It shouldn't be in our bubbles, right? We're talking about a complete cultural shift, and recognizing that the more we tell people to show up as themselves, to tell us who they are, the more we learn and the more we have to keep shifting. That shouldn't be about what happens like at one company versus another, one state, one country, et cetera. So I think that the resource sharing and the brain trust of people doing this work is critical. One, there are some folks doing amazing work that you're not going to hear about in the news. It won't be on like some LinkedIn post. It's not going to go viral somewhere, who can just say like, oh, I did that. And let me just give you some guidance on how I put that survey out, or how I convinced my C-suite to engage in this work, or the resources that I brought in to have an outside speaker affirm what I was saying and validate the work I'm trying to do. Like, that brain trust first. And if you don't know where to find it, just hit me up. I have a few pockets that I'd love to share with you, okay? Because I find that so important. And then when it comes to the actual work, I think about it, and maybe because I have like a policy sort of mindset, but it's like running a campaign. And when I did a lot of my legislative and lobbying work, it was on behalf of the LGBTQ community. So always marginalized, not officially counted in any demographic census survey or anything like that. So, you know, when you're not counted, you're considered invisible. And when you're invisible, it's easy to draw the lines around you, through you, and without you. So I had to really think like, okay, what are the ways that I can connect to folks? If I go into a room and say like, queer youth need housing, and people are like, I don't believe that LGBTQ identities exist, I'm out of the door immediately. But if I think about really challenging myself to do what I ask others to do, which is center each other's humanity, that lawmaker, for example, that C-suite exec, your people leader, your obstinate finance director, they have something, there's something that you can connect to. And so you have to get to know them. You have to learn more about them, share more about yourself. Something that we talk a lot about at Snap is just building empathy through storytelling. And not because we want to just sit and kiki about the traumas that we've all suffered, but it's really because we want to know each other. I constantly am learning and humbled. Sometimes like that uncomfortable stomach turn is like, dang, I really messed that up, but now I've learned. And other ways, I've had to think about my own vulnerability in order to understand that I am a person working with other people, trying to change behaviors that we were all deeply ingrained with. So I think about that, like, who are you connecting with? Who in the business is saying like, yes, I want this, but not allowing you to do it? And then for folks who are making the moves now, who are interviewing right now, who are looking to move into DEI, I say this with a little trepidation. Having a passion around something is actually a little different than thinking about the skills that it takes to move change. This is like organizational culture. This is policy and procedure making. This is actually strategic planning and operationalizing that. This is program management. This is engaging cross-functional stakeholders. And sometimes I think you get fatigued when you're driven to do the work because you feel it, you see it, you hear it, and then you have no process by which you can execute against it. And that is why I worry about burnout across the industry for folks who do this work like us. But if you're like, you know what, I just want to go to work, but I'll contribute when like my DEI leader asks me for something, or I feel comfortable raising my hand. You don't have to own the thing. You don't have to take it on. But I want to sort of recognize that, like I was talking to my brother-in-law about this, and he's like, I don't know how you do this work. He was like, every day you have some story. You've been telling me stories for years. He was like, I couldn't do it. I would lose my mind. I would curse people out. I would, I'm fatigued. He's like, I don't understand. And he's like, and you wake up excited. And I was like, yeah, because I feel like this is what I can offer to the space. I'm willing to do that. Just like there are other folks who are willing to march, protest, use the microphone, who are willing to write the laws, willing to support the bail fund, willing to run for office, willing to take those personal body threats to themselves or their families. This is what I feel like I can contribute to it. And so when you're thinking about like, I'm interested in DEI, I have a passion for this work, it doesn't always have to be entering a role like this. Like most of us, many of us have done the work without the title. And I think in some ways can go further than having any official title will allow us.
Absolutely. I think that is really important to remember, and also not leading into this work because someone asked you to, or they think that you would be the best to do it and give you unpaid emotional labor as well as a volunteer kind of position too, and really thinking that about that and how you would like to show up in this work. It's all really important as well. And you mentioned too, not doing this work, change doesn't happen in a bubble or, just with conversations with ourselves. And SNAP is a global organization too. And it's important that this equity work is not paradoxical, I think that's the word, and doesn't have that colonization or westernization lens. Defining terms, having common language is important. How do you think about really cultivating diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on that local level and acknowledging where people are in their journey overall?
Again, with the question, this is a great question. It's great, I think it's something that we're trying to figure out right now, right? So I don't want to come in and be like, oh, we've got to figure it out.
Yeah.
I think that there are a few things that come to mind. One, when we think about, I don't want to say this work has started by any means. If we think about it as civil rights work, there are civil rights activists and leaders around the globe. So trying to challenge yourself to move outside of like a Western and even like an American framework, specifically of what sort of marginalization looks like. And because in the US, I think we definitely talk a lot about like race and ethnicity and gender identity. And then we might venture into other pockets of like veteran status, LGBTQ identity, right? But I think if we look globally, especially when you're working in a company, you want like a foundation for what the company says. This is what we value. This is how we want our team members to show up. This is the culture we're trying to curate. And we recognize that we benefit from these different lived experiences and identities coming into the space. But really, this idea of diversity and inclusion is local, right? So something that we've been trying to do at SNAP is shift the conversation a little bit and trying to think about communities who have historically been marginalized, who's been kept from power. What does that look like in India versus the UK versus Germany versus Canada, or in Australia? Like, who's not normally been in the room, who's not usually the decision maker? And then, of course, trying to reflect, ideally, parity of diversity with the populations that we're operating around. And sometimes that means where there is less racial diversity or ethnic diversity in a particular country, where that tends to be just more homogenous, we have to push ourselves to think like, who historically has not held power? There are always, unfortunately, groups of haves and have-nots, and trying to reframe that and help folks understand. Like, I've talked to folks who are like, oh, we don't have racism here. I won't name the country. They're like, we don't have racism here. I'm like, what are you talking about? And having these back and forth with like, oh, that's an American concept, or we don't think about Black people this way. And I was like, really? What about xenophobia, right? Or like, what about, and I try to give examples, not trying to say I know more about their home experience than they do, right? But it's, are you sure about this? The concepts around identity and colorism and majority groups are actually global. How we respond to them, how we can engage them, what legal support we have to do that is going to be on a local level. So we're trying to do our best, at least at SNAP, to seed our teams with local experts on this. So it's not just, although we do have a multinational team that's based in the US, it's sort of, how do we make sure that people on the ground really understand what's going on? And it's not us exporting an idea of what DEI needs to look like in any given country that we operate in.
I think that's a good phrase to use, not exporting these ideas as well, and just thinking that we know best. Really, I feel like you gave examples of having conversations, really asking curiosity-based questions, and really having a dialogue and coming to a common ground. Is there, I know our time together is ending, and I feel like I could ask you questions for hours, but is there a moment that comes to mind? I know you've had a lot of different experiences, and this work is long and hard. Again, change doesn't happen overnight, but what is one that comes to mind?
It's a really good question. It's something, so in 2019, this is when I was still working at the LGBT Center in New York. The then Governor Cuomo finally signed into law a ban on something called the gay trans panic defense. And essentially, it was a law that said, in New York, my wife and I could be walking on the street, someone could violently attack us, including death, and then say in court, as part of like an affirmative defense, I lost my mind, temporary insanity, because seeing queer people, seeing two women, seeing a trans person caused such an affront that I panicked and I acted in this way, right? It was pulled out of me. And when you hear it, yeah, you're making a face like, are you kidding me?
What the heck? Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because it sounds wild and it's scary, right? It's scary to think about that because, and this is not like one of those, a law that was on the books for years and years and no one ever used it. You can look up the case of like Islan Nettles, for example. It's been used contemporaneously. It's still legal in most states in the United States. And New York, people often think about this like bastion of liberalism and everyone's like, oh, New York is so great. But really there's New York City and has its own challenges for sure. And then there's the rest of New York State. And but for like 45% of the population being in New York City, New York would look very different in terms of its politic and how it operates. So trying to build a movement around this, it had been introduced several times in both houses in New York. It had sponsorship, but didn't have a lot of engagement. Community groups in different ways have been like, hey, this is kind of something we should address, but building a groundswell, and more importantly, thinking about hate crimes more broadly and trying to say like, hey, if this can be legalized here, if this is a defense people can use, think about all the other unprotected groups that we're not sort of talking about. And so building a coalition that wasn't just queer groups fighting for this, but racial advocacy groups and women's rights groups and reproductive groups being like, hey, literally the rising tide lifts all boats. And what was so amazing about it was one, getting it through both houses, passing both houses, and then it passed on Juneteenth in 2019. And it was just like, whoa, this is a thing. And it's something, I mean, it was 3 years ago and I feel like I lost 2 years to the pandemic. So in my mind, it was last year. But when I think about, it's like a tangible win, like it can no longer be used. It doesn't mean that we prevent the violence against our community, but it does mean that we are then not second class in the way we're treated. Like, what other community could you say, I violently assaulted them because they were Black, right? We call that a hate crime. We said that you can't do that, but you could have done it because they were queer, like blasphemous. So I think New York, I think at the time was maybe the 7th state to pass that. And now it's picking up traction across the country, like more states are doing it, but being a part of that and really feeling connected to community and to lawmakers and to multiple coalitions of folks who care about social justice is something that I still feel really just proud of. And it's one of those things where my mom, who loves me and supports me overall, but like she remembers that. And I think I can't help but feel a little bit like, oh, my mom remembers, like I've done some things, but like she remembers this one thing. So that makes me feel good too. It's definitely a proud moment. And just remembering the power of the people, right? The power of the people, that is never lost on me.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a huge proudest moment. And I appreciate you sharing that here today as well. I think that is an incredible impact you have on the community and also just on other communities as well, as you talked about too. Shijuade, is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring to takeaways, or however many that you would like audience members to really leave with after they hear our conversation?
I think I want to encourage folks, maybe just 2 things: to be curious and not critical. I think it's really easy. Someone asked me recently, like, how can you do this work? You work for a tech company, you sold out. I was like, I don't think I've sold out. I actually am still the same person. I promise you, if you've known me across jobs, I'm still the same person.
Yep, the same person.
But it's also okay because you don't have to do that, right? I think sometimes we feel like, I don't want to sell out or something like that. I don't feel like I've sold out at all. I think I've maintained my integrity in each space. But if I ever felt like that, I would just move into a new space. And so we don't all have to do the same thing. We actually need everybody collectively, the person who's going to throw the brick like Stonewall, and the person who's going to run for office and try and get the bill passed. Like, we need that cradle of engagement to create real change that's sustainable. And so when you see something, instead of automatically going to your corner of like, that's not my thing, I don't like it, blah, 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 it's easy. But I encourage you to try to be curious. And maybe there's a chance that you will learn something. Maybe you won't, but at least you've given yourself the chance to explore that. So I think that's the one thing I would like to leave with folks, because we're getting to a space where I think it's really, 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 really easy just to be in our little like insular buckets of right and wrong.
Yeah.
And you got to stay hungry in this work. And so in order to do that, you have to ask questions.
Yeah, you have to stay hungry in this work. And also there is a lot of conversations that need to be had, and just having that open mind and being curious is really, really helpful to getting to that understanding as well. Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much for the invite again, Christina.
Of course. And as a reminder, folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employers and employees being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the company to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Bye.